Okay. So we're going to be now seeing a movie. And the movie will be about neurotransmission. You will see action potentials arriving. You will see fusion of vesicles, release, release of neurotransmitters, binding to receptors, and opening of the ion channels. You will also see that receptors have to travel they get placed up into the membrane, the postsynaptic membrane. And they get removed from membranes. Do they do this by themselves? Or do they need proteins to either remove them or put them up? They need proteins. Right. So, what happens if a protein that removes a glutamate receptor, there's too much of this protein?
So the neurotransmitter will less bind to its receptors?
Not really. Well, if the protein is too much of this protein, it removes the receptors. And the neurotransmitter has no one to bind to. Okay? So, let's say that there is an illness. Now, you remember that I told you that for learning to occur, you have to have strengthening of synaptic contacts. You have to have glutamate receptors up on the membrane. So, what happens if you have too much of a protein that removes glutamate receptors?
So it'll prevent the formation of stable connection between the synapses.
And you cannot form new memories. What is an illness in which you have trouble with your memory? Do they know Alzheimer's?
Alzheimer's.
Have they heard of Alzheimer's? Okay, it's an illness of elderly people. It usually happens in older age,
주사는 노출을 저대로한다 그래서
and you can no longer make new memories.
주사는 제거서를 좀 들으셔도 그래서
I ask a question, they answer the question.
선생님이 좋았다고 해서 문제를 내게
5 minutes later, they ask me the same question. They don't remember that we just discussed it.
가방가이 저 얘기를 좋았다고 그래서 그거는 얘마다 제스레스
5 minutes later, they ask the question again. They have no memory. Have any of you seen a person who has this problem?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. You will see in the movie that this protein that removes glutamate receptors is one of the proteins that's elevated in Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so let's look at the movie.
In the brain, connections between neurons are called synapses, and these have to be strengthened to convert short-term memories into long-term memories. When an electrical signal arrives at a synapse, neurotransmitters are released. They diffuse across the synapse and bind to glutamate receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. The activated receptor opens up, allowing ions to quickly pass through and pass the signal on to the next neuron. Receptors normally move up to the membrane and are removed from the membrane by the actions of a number of proteins. One of these proteins is STEP. Its actions on the receptor lead to the rapid removal of the receptors from the membrane. When STEP levels are elevated, there is a significant removal of these receptors from the synaptic site. The signal between neurons is broken, and the formation of new memories cannot happen.
Synapses. An action potential, look, you can see them. One arrives. Neurotransmitter is released. Binds to a glutamate receptor. The receptor opens. Ions flow through. Okay, it produces an new action potential. On the membrane, we have glutamate receptors. They go up and they come down. Here's a protein called STEP that removes these glutamate receptors. So if there's too much STEP, no more receptors. No more action potential and difficulty to form memories. Do they want to see it again?
Yes.
Did you bring popcorn? No, we're not going to see it. Okay. Here we go. Yeah. So when you see the light going down an axon, that's an action potential. That's because I made a movie, so you could see it. In real life, it doesn't have this color. Roll them. Flying into the brain. You see the synapses there? Let's fly into the synapse. It's just paused for some reason. Okay. There are many different types of cells in the brain. These are neurons. And these are other cells that support these neurons. They provide nutrients
근저에 원자 저번가 있는 칼라들이 키우고레스.
One important function is that they make the myelin.
다음에 건조기 제일 개집기까지 그래서 나타나 원자 저번 다음에 주로가 매즈 취신세지가 매즈 취신대에 매즈 취신게 tum이들레스.
The myelin that wraps around the axon, it's not. The point here is there are many types of cells, and neurons are one type of brain cell. So let's roll it. We'll go back in the brain. We'll see these synapses, oligodendrocytes. Neurotransmitter, glutamate, binds to its receptor. Receptor will open. The ions will travel through. If there's enough of a signal, they produce the action potential. Glutamate receptors traffic up and down from the membrane. If too many are removed, you don't have any glutamate receptors. And you cannot form action potentials. No. And you cannot form new memories. Okay. Questions?
어디 나론 대학이디 내가서 경고 차도 잠바 가르치는 거 마음으로 줘요.
So Paul, so his question is, why do the proteins that remove the glutamate receptors comes to elevate or?
Okay.
So
this is a great question. Proteins have a life. They are born and they eventually get removed. The removal is very tightly regulated. And sometimes it no longer works. So the protein is made, but not removed. And slowly you get more and more of this protein. So, one thing that we can try to do is to discover a medicine, a drug, that inhibits the activity of this particular protein. There's too much protein. There's too much protein, too much activity of this protein, so maybe we can discover a drug that you take that inhibits the activity of the protein that Do you understand why the protein is increased? In general, there are two ways that you can get too much protein. Either you make too much, you translate too much, or you don't degrade the protein. Any more questions? Yeah.
Temba yore. Temba te ganzandi 말라가니근 탄섬 거르때다 그 대시점에 된적 거에 대가리. 근데 지금 통이 잠바당 근데 다 라잔 통이 잠바지 거라. 근데가 모터당 까리 잡으러 그 로고 모터에 지까리 모터.
So this question is memory. So why do you explain memory in terms of the connection between two synapses and like visual memory and sensory memory or like a touch sensation, memory from touch sensation? The suk tongking it tembatan tene karsa? Rija. So is there a difference between visual memory and touch sensation memory, touch memory? And is it in form of a chemical or electrical signal?
Okay, so memory, again, in general, is the turning of a short-term memory into a long-term memory. Whether it's touching, learning what smooth feels like, learning what his face looks like, which this uses touch receptors, this uses visual input. In both cases, those sensory inputs go up the spinal cord, up into the brain. In the case of visual, okay, it goes to the visual cortex. In the case of touch, it goes to the somatosensory cortex. From there, it goes to other areas of the brain. And these other areas of the brain, the synapses get stronger. So initially, I see his face, I don't know him. But as I see him many, many times, I move over to long-term memory because the synapses in the visual cortex and other brain parts of the visual cortex are strengthened. Every time I see him, then there are now more axons connecting, or there's more glutamate being released, or there are more receptors. So every time I see his face, there's a much stronger connection to this part of the brain. Does this make sense? Okay. Also, you asked, is it action potentials or is it chemical neurotransmission? Is it one or the other or both? So it's both. Both. You have an action potential arrive, neurotransmitter is released. That leads to more little axons being made. That leads to new receptors being put in the membrane.
닐렘바 마르로서 그래.
That might lead to more glutamate being released.
다이면은 원자 틈바 글루타메트 레야 마르로서 그래.
But the end result is that the synapse has been strengthened.
이마이나 디기디 창막이 다 준델라 가르스나 원자 저번이 바로 이 뒤순 얘기 바로 이다 뒤줄주라 뒤줄 때는 그랬어.
Before very quiet. After learning happens, it's much louder, and now you can hear me. Every time I see his face, I know who it is.
저는 당보도 갈 수 있는 코니 빠르게 뒤줄 때는 배 쿠슨 거 따네 계속 힘에 원하신들 이래서
Pop up anytime. Pop up anytime you have it. Okay, so now one more example. Again, let's go to a unconscious memory. We talked earlier about learning to ride a bike. As I said earlier, initially you don't know, your legs don't know what to do. The body doesn't have good balance. As you practice and practice and practice, the synaptic connections get stronger. It involves action potentials and release of neurotransmitter. And as when you started, you could not ride a bike. You fell over. You couldn't ride a bike and you fell over, is what I said. But as you turn this into long-term memories, you ride a bike perfectly. Okay, since we're talking about muscles, let's talk about muscles. Uh-oh. What is his name in Tibetan? Chamba.
Because David means love.
And what does Paul mean? Wisdom.
No, difficult.
No. Okay, David has a comment. Oh no.
Okay, so if you learn things through those synaptic connections, how do you forget?
What do you think? So the connection gets broken, connection gets breaking.
Difficult. Yes, we think that the connections get weaker. Now, when you do something and you don't have to use you don't do it consciously, you do it subconsciously. We might call it a habit. there are skillful habits and there are unskillful habits.
다음에 zel yekini 다음에 공시단 zel 메키니 공시스 그래. 네, 그래서 나 skillful 스티가 zel 메와 되는 오시고.
In the West, we teach that meditation and Buddhist study is a good way to reduce unskillful habits.
Unskillful means
Bad.
bad
Bad habit.
Bad means, we don't use the word good, bad means, unskillful means it leads to dukkha. Leads to increase of dukkha.
저 상당히는 먼저 남배 있다에는 공주기 냠랜드기 먼저 공시 냠바서 그랬다 공시 지금 미게위에서 그랬다 들리로 공시 직파 매와 셀토야라 네다네 남배 있다 공주기 펜토고레스 제 먼저 딱 늪초 체리바 냠시바 망고치기도 이치치고레스.
Who can give me examples of unskillful habit?
다이나 공시 냠바 다치 미게위 있다 들리 공시 비준 주시바이나 그래는 조사를. So very angry, hatred,
Okay, so
impulsiveness.
impulsiveness, if you get in a difficult situation and you immediately become angry.
지난달에 직갱이 받은 최대 정말 람삼치 롱라 콘도스아들이 책으로 왔어.
Another one.
신바. 남다. Fear,
Anxiety.
fear.
These are unskillful emotional habits.
다음에 다음에 컨트롤 다음에 센트레이드 들어 emotional. 다음에 용서를 단다와에 다음에 공시되기 들어왔어.
So with knowledge that Paul's been teaching you, make a hypothesis what might change in your brain if you do meditation and Buddhist practice and you become less angry and less fearful and less anxious.
저는 먼저 지금 같이 그래 컨트롤 다한다 즉 센트다 남자다 이게 그 용어로 땅 보도 정말 용어로 땅도 참바다 공주기 냠랜드 이게 다네 먼저 레벨라 규라 컨비 다 규라 그랬던 거래서 레벨라 규라 그랬던 거. So it weakens their connection.
Exactly. We hypothesize, we don't know, but we hypothesize that with proper practice, you can weaken the connections underlying those emotions in your brain.
저선다 듣는데 일단 영적 냠바디디 가서다네 겐드기로다 겐드기로다 근데 겹종기다네 왕자기다네 투저디디 가스나코 총 단계에서 레스 삼체다 들리 처바체고다 처샤체고다.
You can strengthen the connections that underlie compassion.
다이네 닌제다 참 닌제기 다이네 시덴드기로다 들리 왕자기 다이네 투저디디 가스나 땡 투저디디 템보소고다. 땡으로던 거레스.
So in that way, you can actually change the connectivity of your brain, and that change your emotional responses to situations.
저산다 듣는데 왜다 레벨이 기로하던데 땅체네 다 가서다 켄켄데 체도 참바들라 옐렌기다네 용서기 옐렌디디 제당 고기로하던 그레스.
So think about it. Right now, I'm talking to you, and I'm changing all the synapses in your brain.
저는 이 기란sol다 럽트체 계속해도 참바 기란솔 남기 레벨 다네 원자 타고 망고치라다 기로하던 거레스니.
I don't mean all, I mean a few. I'm changing some synapses in your brain, and that's how you go away and you remember what I said.
저는 참마 이게 말다 같이 찍라다네 투저디기 다 기로하던 체네 다 럽트기 제가 기란솔 미 가려 럽트체가 땡토기도 왔어.
When you're talking to each other and you're learning from each other, you're actually changing each other's brains.
또 직질을 계제시에네 직직산에 다 로케사와드네 라데 참바 네 레베는 게다네 코바디들 기로도 버레스.
Thank you. So, 2 points.
And they didn't need this.
Meditation and how it affects the brain,
저선다 공주기 냠랜디기 레벨을 들어갔던 게 있네.
we don't know enough about it.
네 도가면서 싫어하시는 게 메스.
If you get interested, this is a good area to connect what you love in the Buddhism way and neuroscience.
기색이라서 네 도로 더나 여봐야나 이제 원자 체력이 원자 체력 단단한 시다 기란적인 낭비주의 바로 따네 지금 상관으로 따네 저와서 사기 따네 네 직디 차고 그랬어.
Okay. So, the second thing I wanted to mention was David mentioned habits.
아니 이거도 가르치는 habits 다 again David 기타나 공시세를 걸로 기재해서 왔어.
Often habits are very good. Because it allows you to, in another part of the brain, learn something that you don't have to think about anymore in your cortex. So, for example, when you learn how to ride a bike, initially very difficult and you have to use a lot of your cortex. As those memories strengthen, it's because synapses are formed in the basal ganglia. And you can think of many habits that you do. Every morning, for example, you may have a certain sequence of things that you do because it's a habit. Sometimes habits, though, are not good because they can interfere with your ability to function normally in the world. I will describe now another disorder. It's called Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder. Obsessive, okay. Obsessions are thoughts that keep on going round and round in your head. And compulsions are actions you do to try to get rid of the thoughts in your head. We all have a little bit of obsessive compulsive behavior. You know, cleaning yourself, walking along your room and seeing something on the floor and picking it up. That's normal. But sometimes you have thoughts in your mind that make you very anxious. So, for example, and then you do a behavior or an action to get rid of that thought. Here's an example. Something bad is going to happen to my mother. Something bad is going to happen to my mother. But if I come over here to the light switch and hit it 5 times. 5 times.
지난달에 박사는 because 대망하듯이 parse치les.
The bad thing won't happen.
다음에 게임에마다 제일 말했어.
And you can understand that if every day, all the time, excuse me. I have to go back and do that. I can't function in the world.
지난달에 니마 따라서 도스체를 그래서 마치에다 따라서 내가 다다체 들어가서 그랬어.
Sometimes the compulsion is to wash your hands.
삼성마다 compulsions 해야 된다. 그래서 라바시고 그랬어.
The thought is your hands are dirty.
나 선거 가서 미 라바데 쪼쪼쪼쪼르샤스.
So I go wash my hands.
지난달에 나다 라바추.
My hands are dirty. A minute later, I go and wash my hands. Okay? To the point sometimes that you start bleeding. Okay, so this can be a very difficult problem. The part of the brain that we think is involved in habit formation is the basal ganglia. And the part of the brain which we believe is involved in obsessive-compulsive disorder is the basal ganglia. My hands are dirty. I go wash them. This is a habit. A habit. It probably involves the basal ganglia. So, yes, we would like to help the patient forget those memories. To block those memories. Should I talk about PSD briefly? No, okay. So there are other disorders that are similar to this. But I was supposed to talk about the muscle system. So I need to move on. But are there questions about obsessive-compulsive disorder or bad habits or anything else? Yes.
Tikol bajela bet kan sewan rochin kan bet ta kupen na godo yanjo yanjo tigo ta dil michik ta de chun chema chun ima bet mambutu shaba ina kol jwa tirti ma michik da kol tan de chikandar la godo tigo na fotu ma jwa.
So what would happen if somebody with this obsessive-compulsive disorder is forcefully kind of prevented or forcefully put under supervision of somebody who like forces him not to do this action? So
what you're asking is, how do we treat people like this? And we could tie their hands together. Tie them to a chair. What Western medicine has tried to do is to develop medications that help to reduce the thoughts and the compulsions. So often it doesn't work. So they've developed other types of treatments as well.
가서 우리 소열에서
Behaviors so one is called cognitive behavioral therapy.
다티 저덕지기 맨날 가서나 간저 희독이 cognitive
Behavior.
희독이 따네 가서 그래 희독이 따 검시 희독이 희가 그래 다들 저덕세지 그래서 다티
So let's say you have a repetitive thought.
저선다 경향이 섬 레베나로 딴 섬로 때 양다인데 코르데이 섬로 주요 바이나
Something bad will happen to my mother.
니 아마라 킹이 버체서레 섬주드니
My hands are dirty.
니 라바 쪼고
Two examples. So what you do with a therapist sitting next to you is you try to sit. Something bad will happen to my mother. The anxiety starts to rise. I get more and more tense. You try to stay with it for a minute. The next day for 2 minutes. The next day 3 minutes. At the end of the time, you go over here. You're allowed to go and do this. But you've stayed 3 minutes. So you try. You try to sit with the anxiety and discover that it's not going to do anything.
저선다에네 심체 요바 간식라 드니로에다 삼도 심체 요바 간식라 그 딜라 얄렌카에 맞춰봐도 데데바이나 이네 그 심체 디기 말라 다네 경카에 제기면도세 다시네 고츠 그레스.
Sometimes this type of therapy is very useful.
삼삼라 딘로에다 쳇톱데네 펜도여레스.
Okay. Tea time. Okay, motor cortex.
Motor cortex. We're
now going back to what I was supposed to be talking about, which is muscles. You may not have this. I don't know if you have this slide. I'm sorry, because I just put it in a few days ago. Do you have these slides? Yes or no?
No.
Oh, okay. But so you can just listen for a while. So this is review. You've already learned this.
Yeah, some of them have.
Yeah, it was, okay, fine. It was in the earlier lecture also. So this is the motor cortex. We're now going to talk about muscles. A neuron here in the motor cortex fires. Because you've decided to pick up a glass and drink it. The axon that comes is here, travels down the spinal cord. Arrives at a motor neuron that's in the spinal cord. Okay, and then from the spinal cord a new neuron, an axon arrives and goes all the way down to the muscle. So motor cortex, down the spinal cord, into right here where there is something called a motor neuron. So if we tap this, so what you've just seen is the motor neuron, a neuron from the motor cortex, action potential down to the spinal cord.
저장 균박이 잘라 레직 톱체투.
A synapse is between this neuron and the motor neuron.
저장다 이내 원자 타본 강마대당 당나신 구조 원자 타본 주도 어디니 바로라 투섬지기는 두그레스.
This motor neuron lives here
저장 구조 원자 타본데 균바 나올라 이레스.
and sends a neuron out to the muscle.
다이네 샤듬라파기 다게스튼 당그레스.
So we've never talked about axons coming down the spinal cord.
저장당 간저 다게스튼 고 균박이 잘라 마도 코르라 키제 키니 헤요 마레스.
So let's say this is 5 different axons traveling down.
저장다디 다게스튼 문다 나 든지 바 균박이네 마 도기 바차쇼스.
And I want to move my arm.
저장이 라바 구지 당고 요바이나.
So somewhere right about here,
다 균바 디 파로라.
there, is the axon to move the arm.
다이네 라바 구지 당이 다이네 다게스튼 데요레스.
This one perhaps is to make the diaphragm breathe, the move.
저장다 다게스튼 셴바데 가스나 간저 다이프라임 스틱 만저 우당데 가라디 원고치 로아기 와라.
This one is to raise your leg.
셴바데 가스나 간저 강바 구지 당이 원자.
This one is to move your toe.
저장다 드는데 다 강바기 다 주고든 리피주다.
And each axon comes down a little lower.
저장다 디기네 원자 다게스튼 디기고 여사데 가스나 균바기 다 사자 림베르미스네 마 강강네 마도 그랬다.
So all these axons do the same thing, however, they
다게스는 되게 정말로 이따 두몽기 다 저와 가르쳐 버렸으나
make synaptic contact. So here's the one for the arm, making a synaptic contact with a motor neuron. And that motor neuron sends an axon here that innervates the muscle.
저는 근저네 샤듬라 투 그랬어. 다네 강네 원자 다게스는 지렙 네 구주 원자 타술라네 투 구주 원자 타술 되게 네 샤듬라 파투 그랬어.
Okay, so now we're going to look at a muscle.
당한저 샤듬라 타긴스.
This here, for example, may be my biceps.
저선다디 가서 그래. 샤듬데 단다이 봉가냐 송데 마차쇼스.
A part of my biceps.
봉가냐 송세 가상은 저장해 봐.
You see how there are these circles here?
저선다 고르고르 든데다.
This whole thing is the muscle,
저선데 간장 라인에 샤듬 쓰고레스.
but this is a bundle of muscle fibers.
따디기 난게 단다 고르고르디 가르스나 네 샤듬기 찌꾸 착바든데레스. 찌꾸기 착바. 파이버스 때문에 찌꾸라. 반버스 때문에 다 착바라.
And this is a muscle cell.
따네 디 춤춘데 가르스나 네 접접데 가르스나 네 샤듬기 원자 샤듬 타봉레스. 샤듬 타봉.
Okay, so muscle consists of many different muscle bundles.
저선다에는 샤듬데 가르스나 샤듬기 찌꾸 차바 망보치기 두바레 샤듬기 찌꾸 차바 망보디 샤듬기 다 타봉 망보치기 두바 있었다.
And each bundle consists of many muscle fibers.
Muscle fibers. 아니 찌꾸 차바디기 찌꾸 망보치기 두바라.
And now we have to send our neuron to make synaptic contact with this muscle cell.
다드네르 원자 가서 그래. 샤듬 타봉데라 단다기 다키 차던데 투고레스.
Okay, here you see the axon is arriving.
저단다 다키 차던데 랩.
It makes contact with the muscle cell.
저단에 샤듬기 타봉데라 자르그레스.
And they are called, remember earlier we were saying in neuroscience many words are made up of two other words.
저선당 먼저 동보네 원자선이 나올 단위 망보이 왔지 단위 되기가 단위 찍네 단위 망보치기 좀 시작이더니 차되고라.
So this is the case here. Neuron, muscle, we've put together, so we have Neuromuscular Junction.
저선당 Neuromuscular Junction 세대 따네 왕자 샤듬기 대창스그라 그다음에 지금 망고지 소 스페셜가 자
Now, for you to understand what happens at the neuromuscular junction,
근데 먼저 셔름기 제품 라인에 같이 위로된 하고 드레스
this is the neuromuscular junction,
근데 먼저 셔름기 제품들이다.
and we have to fly in here. Okay, here it is. Here's the incoming axon, and we have to fly into this structure. Okay, so what happens when the action potential arrives at this neuromuscular junction? Even though I have not talked about it yet, you know the answer. Because it's very similar to what happens at all synaptic connections.
Release of neurotransmitters.
Bingo! How do you say bingo? Anyway, these are these are the synaptic vesicles here at the neuromuscular junction. What is the neurotransmitter inside these vesicles?
Excitatory, some say it can be both, excitatory and inhibitory.
It's neither. Not glutamate, not GABA, but a new neurotransmitter called acetylcholine.
But it's still excitatory.
Oh yeah, but I asked for the name. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter, but it's not. But it's a new one that we haven't met yet. It's called acetylcholine. It has its own structure. Okay, carbon, hydrogens, carbon, oxygen. Remember what this is?
Potassium.
No, that's K. It's nitrogen.
Nitrogen, right?
Nitrogen. Anyway, this is a small molecule that binds very tightly to the acetylcholine receptor. So, before the arrival of the action potential, is the acetylcholine receptor open or closed?
Closed.
Okay, the acetylcholine binds, and what happens to the ion channel? It opens. And what ion flows through? Sodium, yeah.
Oh, sodium? This is not nitrogen.
No. No.
N said in sodium.
Yeah.
A said in sodium.
Sodium. Okay? Sodium. You remember this? Potassium. Potassium. You were potassium? Okay, so what have we said? We said, okay, does acetylcholine bind to glutamate receptors?
Acetylcholine glutamate 내려받아 자기를
That's a big word to say no. Okay, no, it doesn't. Does glutamate bind to the acetylcholine receptor?
glutamate acetylcholine 내려받아 자기를
Gamma ray. Of course, GABA. Does GABA bind to acetylcholine receptor?
acetylcholine 내려받아 자기를
Gamma ray. Okay, fine. So each neurotransmitter has its own receptor. And the receptor at muscle is acetylcholine receptor. Okay, just to go further in, this is the presynaptic terminal, these are vesicles, and acetylcholine is there. Okay, and then we have the muscle fiber. Okay, there are many different structures in a muscle cell. And one is a storage site for calcium. It's like a big box or can. It's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum.
What is sarco? What does sarco mean?
Do you know? I don't know what it means. I don't know. Sarco. It probably has something to do with muscle. Because do you remember the endoplasmic reticulum? Did you ever hear of that? The endoplasmic. Okay, yes. In other cells, the liver cells, heart cells, spleen cells, you have the endoplasmic reticulum. Sarco, meaning muscle, is the same as the endoplasmic reticulum, but in muscle. But the major point here is that it stores calcium. Yeah, okay, and also sarcoplasmic, so muscle reticulum means a net. Do you know what a net is? It's sort of sometimes you catch fish in nets. Sometimes you sleep under a net. Okay? So okay, or you catch a butterfly with a net. So that's what this is, the net in the muscle cell that stores calcium. So now an action potential arrives. We're going to release neurotransmitter. It's going to go over here to bind to the receptors. Sodium will flow in, depolarizing the muscle cell. And look what happens to the calcium. It's released. So let me go over. We'll go over that again. Action potential arrives.
레죽
Vesicles fuse, release acetylcholine.
에스틸콜린 들르
They bind to the acetylcholine receptor.
코란 란기타 넬레 발라잡
This ion channel opens up and sodium flows through.
저단 게들 길럼 되기도 같이 네 부제데 나오죠.
The sodium actually travels down this part of the muscle cell and releases calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum.
Action potential travels down.
No, the sodium.
Sodium travels.
Sodium.
저단 부제데 갈스나 코 나오라 디 코란 람바지도 부제데 갈스나 디기는 로레스 디기는 로데 참바 갈스나 코 칼슘 들르고 있어요. 칼슘 들르서 가와레스나 단다 샤름 셔남 자소 쓰고 있었다. 셔름 자소 쓰고 있었다. 사르코스에 셔름을 한다. 플라즈마 스티가라 셔쿠르 Reticulum 사이드 자소체.
Okay, now we have to look at what the calcium does. We have to blow up this region.
저다에 칼슘이 가르치르스 나와야나 네 단다기 네디 코체를 단치다.
We're going to fly it. You can't see this very well, so I'll show you. But this is blown up here. Can you see? Not very well. Darn it. Okay, better picture. Here we're seeing this blown up picture. Okay, so now we've just flown into the muscle. There are two proteins here that you should know about. One is called actin. And one is called myosin. Do you see on the myosin they have little barbs? Hooks, like a hook. Okay, it's a hook that will that will bind to the actin molecule. Okay, so when calcium binds, remember calcium was released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The released calcium binds to the actin. And now these hooks will be attracted to the actin and bend up. And it will bend and pull the actin together. Okay, you see how it just moved. This is called the muscle contraction. Okay, so now we're going to see a little movie that describes, which shows this all of this. So let me say again what you will see. You will see an action potential arriving at the neuromuscular junction. Acetylcholine vesicles will fuse with the membrane. The acetylcholine will bind to the acetylcholine receptor. It is an ion channel and sodium will flow through. The sodium now has entered the cell and leads to the release of calcium, and the calcium goes and sits on the actin And this attracts the myosin and it pulls the actin to it. And the muscle contracts. Everyone do this. Okay? So you've sent a motor nerve from the motor cortex down to the spinal cord. From there, it hits a motor neuron that goes to the muscle. An action potential arrives, and many of your, and through the sequence that we're going to see now in the movie, that's what leads to the contraction of the muscle. Here's the movie. We're going to first see an action potential arrive. Bam! Fusion of vesicle, release of acetylcholine, sodium flows in, releases calcium. Calcium comes over here to the actin, the myosin grabs it. The muscle contracts, and that's how you get the muscle to move. Do you understand? Do you want to see the movie again?
Yes. They say this.
What? No. Okay, everyone who said no, close your eyes. Yeah. Action potential, release of acetylcholine, binding to receptor, influx of sodium, release of calcium. Calcium comes to the actin. The myosin is attracted. Muscle contracts. Okay, when you go home tonight, okay, do a little debate, okay? Okay, action potential arrives. Right? What happens next? Vesicles are fused with the membrane. Acetylcholine is released. Binds to the acetylcholine receptor. The ion receptor opens. Sodium flows in. Calcium is released. Binds to the actin. And myosin pulls it. Okay? Try this tonight. Okay? You and you, you and you, you and you. That's how you'll learn it. That's how you'll learn it. Okay, next. Okay, so we've said this before. We're just repeating it. So, you've seen, we've talked about release of neurotransmitter. Interaction or binding to receptor. And then the neurotransmitter has to be terminated or taken back into the cell. Release, binding, termination. Okay? Why am I emphasizing this? What is this? Do you have black widow in India? No. No? We have it in America. Yeah. You can it's black. And it has this little symbol, an hourglass.
저는 그 디아블라의 전달기전지
So when it bites you, okay, it releases a toxin.
저는 그래서 소격의 전발 독주려고 그랬어.
What does that toxin do?
저는 독들이 가르쳐 그랬어.
It forces the release of acetylcholine.
네 가르치나 에스틸콜린이라고 그랬어.
Too much acetylcholine.
저는 에스틸콜린의 가르쳐 많다고 그랬어.
Acetylcholine binds to the receptor, but you are unable to end. So the toxin does two things. Too much is released, and because there's too much, you can't end the signal. Okay, so that's how it kills its prey. This is a cobra. When a cobra bites, it releases a toxin. This toxin interferes again with the muscle. Here's the toxin right here. Normally the transmitter binds here. But because the toxin is here, the transmitter can't bind. Okay, what happens? You have no signals at your muscles. In this case, you're paralyzed. And the cobra can eat its mouse. What is this?
I'm just translating paralysis.
Oh, paralysis, yeah. Okay. So, Black Widow releases too much acetylcholine, and you don't have a way of ending the signal. With the cobra, what happens? It blocks. It binds to the receptor at the same site that acetylcholine should bind to. So in this case, it's blocking the interaction with the receptor. Here's a third disease of muscle. You remember, again, the spider, okay, released too much acetylcholine. The cobra toxin binds to the receptor. In this illness, there are too few receptors. So even though you have acetylcholine, even though you have receptors, you have much fewer receptors. So here you have the normal amount, and here you have much fewer. So there are drugs now that we can give in this. There are muscles we can develop that have been developed in this disease. Okay, this disease has many fewer receptors, right? Okay, so you want to increase the life of acetylcholine.
저번에 내리려고 나서도 저쪽 나가서나 에스트콜린디 유료한테 도시단 거랬어.
So you give a drug to prevent it from being destroyed.
저번에 내리려고 나서도 저쪽 나가서나 에스트콜린 먼저 등부당해줘라. 에스트콜린디 등부당해야지 광고체 일단 주제로다.
This disease is characterized by muscle weakness.
되게 나서도 가서나 내다로 가려서 샤르디 조금씩 그랬어.
So, very often the eyelids, one of the first signs. You have trouble opening your eyes.
아니 내가 지금 원서도 오지 가려서 하는 미디 영어 단통 말해서 미 즈마스 그래. 즈마스 막 영어 미 영어 같이 보면 미 같이 보면 나도 말했어.
Okay, so we're almost at the end. So the points you should remember,
Slides.
they're coming up.
아니 잠깐만 봐. 일단 내게 주시지 가려서.
Just wait a second. The very last or next to last slide. Okay, so as you heard, chemical neurotransmission is required for muscles to move.
저번에 샤르디들 그저다라 먼저 제규기 진동 계시고 잘가.
In the case of the muscle, the neurotransmitter is
다음에 샤르디가 자자와는 원서 좀 가려래.
acetylcholine.
에스트콜린이죠.
Say it. Acetylcholine. I'm waiting for the slides. Okay. In any type of neurotransmission, you have to have release of neurotransmitter. Binding to receptor. And by either cutting the neurotransmitter or transporting it in. Release, binding, end. Okay, and we've discussed several different ways that you can interfere with muscle connections.
저선다에는 샤둥기 단다 뒤줄디기딜라에네 가서 우리다 견타에다 유로타에든지 림바 배청 같이 주시면 봐.
The black widow spider does what?
저다 dom이 뭐 나보디 가르쳐 그래.
Releases too much.
저다 아세틸콜린 체레기와를 주고라.
So there's too much there.
저선 체레기와 차버렸어.
The cobra toxin does what?
두두디 가르쳐 그래.
It binds to the receptor.
Blocks the receptor.
It binds to the receptor, so acetylcholine cannot bind. Right. And in myasthenia gravis, the disease I was talking about, there are too few receptors. So here are some of the vocabulary words. Neurotransmitter, synapse, synaptic vesicle, presynaptic neuron, postsynaptic. A type of receptor that allows ions to flow through are called these were the fast ones. These other receptors, G protein coupled receptors, were very slow. We talked about how there are two ways to to get rid of the neurotransmitter, we could
완자 첨바디 매워서 감독이 걸려 자는 거 찍대 가르스나
either take it up
아 찍대 잘렌체
or degrade it.
그러나 구주체 구주스티마라
We talked about the neuromuscular junction. Dopamine is another neurotransmitter. What disease does it cause when it's absent? Parkinson's disease. And then we talked about acetylcholine. So, are there questions? Any?
Gamba se chido wasa ta gamba do ta gambi na lo na ta timba menda rin do ta ka gawa ta ni te menda rin do na ta timba menda la ni na lo ne ka yo kider menda wa yo re ka yo na lo ne zi ta de gamba na lo na na lo ne timba menda la ko bi na lo ko ya zi menda yo re.
So the question is, the synaptic vesicles contain different types of neurotransmitters, and different types of neurotransmitters are, do they have different kind of, like chemical structure, different like chemistry?
Okay. All neurotransmitters have different structure. Glutamate is different from GABA, is different from acetylcholine. Dopamine is different from serotonin, is different from norepinephrine. Typically, and for the purposes of today's lecture, a vesicle has one type of neurotransmitter. So you don't mix glutamate and GABA in a vesicle. Okay? So you have a GABA vesicle. And you have a acetylcholine vesicle. A dopamine vesicle. So they're all different. There are some exceptions. Sometimes you have two neurotransmitters that you don't know about that travel together, but for the most part, that's the answer. Any other questions?
단다디 가사 돔 나고데기 코 가사 엑 단다디 이치라사 엑sit 어딘 가서야 망으로 땅도 참바 zubola 가서야 갱 가레 가서야 지게레 네땅은
So, what will be symptoms of
The black widow spider.
Black widow's?
Yeah. David.
Toxin?
Yeah. So,
So if there's too much acetylcholine.
yeah. So, I'm not sure I'm going to answer this correctly, but I think so. So, with the black widow spider. With the black widow spider venom, too much is released, right? So it binds to the receptors and the signal can't end. Or if it does come off, another one binds, jumps on. So you might almost have, okay, you can't move. This is different from the cobra. The cobra binds to the acetyl receptor, and acetylcholine cannot bind.
지선디기네 두디기네 에스틸콜린기 넬림발라jar 네 에스틸콜린 까샤고다.
In this case, you fall to the ground
지선다이네 쿠마 살라마리 두그레스
and are paralyzed.
지선다이네 샤링 세드로 아네 샤링 세드 차르그레스.
Okay? Next question.
린직 답셀라진도
내주 껍질.
디코 촐로니 동물레디 콜레톤 간네간네
내주 껍질 저거 가리지 그레스.
콜라 린직 테스 니바지 레긴도 온사 아니 다체 산딜 판로톤디 코코네 간네
So the action potential comes through the axon to the terminal. How does it come through axon? What is the factor that triggers the action potential? I think you already talked about it. But
Yeah, let me just repeat it a little bit. So, do you remember yesterday? We talked about how the action potential is started at the axon hillock and travels very rapidly down the axon.
지난 단단하게 물중들라네 레주 답체데 고츠 근데 봐 다게 짜증기네 마 로기에 베콜라만서 가산자인 바스.
It involves at least three different proteins. You were one of these proteins, the pump.
지난달에 딜라 딘디노비 기름 딜라 같으나 디즈민도 숨
We also had-
참고해 주셔서 디즈민도 숨기는 찍게 키라니 가산 탑스마스 붙여야 들어.
We also had the sodium and potassium ion channels,
부지귤럼에 두석하고 귤럼 되는 붙였음.
so that sodium could flow one way and potassium the other way.
지난달 부지데 나로용 두석하고 디출로를 들어.
This led to the action potential being made.
지난달 디기tal 레주 답체 디기 속으로야.
It jumped over, and that moves all the way down the axon.
지난달 디 다게 짜증기네 마 두고로.
Any other questions?
좋아셔봐.
가서 저렇게 소잡라 저렇게 소잡대가 틱도 마트빙 걸라 갑자기 내가 준데 카긴 집상에 개엄을라인데 데덴바이네 데데 쭈여래.
So there's a traditional kind of method to prevent spread of snake toxin. So if you just take the toxin right away after it's bitten,
And spit it out?
spit it out, then
Make a knife. You have a knife. You make an X. You bleed.
so he's wondering if it's true or not.
It is true. Yes, I've done it many times. Many cobras. It's true. Now, it means that you're gathering some of the toxin and spitting it out. There's still some that gets through. Any other questions? Another over there. I'm sorry, we have one more question. Last question.
단다디 나차데라 가르스레 넬렘바 뉴로 조그레라서 단다디 가르스레 단다디 둑디기 왕기 가르스레야 용비어레베 양나 단다디 넬렘바디 뉴체디 단다디 둑기 왕기 용비어레 하나 가리가
So in myasthenia gravis, the reason there's so few receptors is due to some toxin or.
Oh, okay. I didn't explain it completely. But there is an antibody. Have you ever heard of antibodies?
Antibodies
I'm trying to think of a way of explaining it easily. When you get an infection, you make antibodies to fight the infection.
나도 보는 정말 나서지 노래 갑자기 이야기다 목숨들이 중국에서 수고는 목숨들이 중국.
If you have a strep throat, bacteria infection of your throat, you make a lot of antibodies to fight the infection, to kill.
세상에서 장바들이 잡지는 그 깨들은 그 장체 뭐나 우리나라에 가서는 나와 자신만 못 주셔요. 이런데 상관없어 수국이 따뜻이 이안에 같은 것은 갑자기 일단 목숨들이 중국.
Okay? Sometimes, very rarely, the antibodies you make recognize some of your own proteins.
상상과에서는 들리더라도 목숨들이 소소라니 수국이다 가본들이
In myasthenia gravis, an antibody has been made, and in some individuals recognizes the acetylcholine receptor.
지난달에 마이스티제 그레이브스에 나서들 자셔봐니 들리더라도 목숨들이와 ene tanda acetylcholine 닐렘바디 ne torken torshitang.
And it gets removed from the membrane. So those illnesses, there are a whole class of illnesses, luckily quite rare, in which you make antibodies to an infection or a virus or a bacteria, and it recognizes your own proteins, a protein in your body. If it
문치나 나사다들이 직원의 영화다 자신들이 각대자에다 곡수 소리 참아 곡수들이 출다 수수 수국이 타공 다 수국이다 디제들이 그래서 우리 문진체처럼 문진체다 떨어져버다.
Okay. Have a good lunch.
다시 신랑이 붙여놨어.